Right, 4:17, and we are recording, okay. Let's wait for the truck to pass. Right. Hi everyone, Jason here from spiritualbabies.net. We're back for a second of our series, Meet the Sages, where we have a look at some of the show-stopping names of Judaism and the Jewish tradition. We are guided through this library of famous names by our friendly rabbi in Florida, Rabbi Joshua Neely. Thank you for doing this with us.
It's my pleasure. Friendly rabbi in Florida. I like that. I like the alliteration.
We'll have to get some sweatshirts made up. So this week, so last week we did the Rambam. This week something a bit more left field, I think, and unusual. In the A, technically not a rabbi, and B, a female.
Well, yes, until the 20th century, those were redundant statements.
So who are we looking at today?
So we're looking at Salome Alexandra, as she is known in the Hebrew, or Salome Alexandra, as she is known in English. And Salome Alexandra was the last queen of the Hashmonean dynasty. She was also the only true ruling queen of the Hashmonean dynasty, and indeed one of only two queens that were the real rulers of the people of Israel. The first being back in the days of Judah and an usurper, and not really well liked or respected. So that really puts Salome Alexandra in a class of her own as being the last Hashmonean ruler and the only good queen there's ever been, and really a very pivotal figure, standing at a pivotal age that has been ignored by many of the classes and the programs and the courses that people go through. But to understand how Judaism is shaped during the first century BCE and then onwards, you really have to know the tensions that she was facing and how she handled them, which set the stage for everything that was about to come.
When I was researching her, because I admit her name hadn't really come up before in anything I'd looked at, it became apparent very quickly that firstly, she was the most recent, if you like, as you said, ruler of Israel when Israel was a completely free state, like
right.
a true monarch, an absolute reigning monarch, sovereign monarch. And B, she seemed to single-handedly plant the seeds which allowed Judaism to flourish as a what's the best way of saying it? As a kind of religious. She made the format and put the practices in place that allowed that to happen. Would that be fair?
Absolutely. She played a very important political role in giving space for the Judaism that was being developed by the sages and being offered as a counter to the ever increasing corruption of the temple Judaism of the time. And without that, Judaism would have been in real trouble in another 200 years. So, yeah, we're probably getting ahead of ourselves.
Yeah, we are a little bit.
For lasting effects, but we haven't even talked about who she is.
It's probably worth mentioning. She was born in 141 BCE,
right.
And she lived quite a full life. I mean, in length terms, for people of that age, I think yes. She did very well. And can you tell us a little bit about her family and particularly her relationship with her siblings?
Well, before we get into that, I just want to make sure we take care of the, as Wikipedia likes to put it, the disambiguation. Because a lot of people, when they hear the name Salome, immediately think to a character from the Christian Bible and the beheading of John the Baptist. This is not that Salome. So for everyone that was listening and saying, how can they be talking so glowingly about this person? This is not that Salome. That Salome is generally attributed to be the daughter of Herod, and had a very different character and a very different role to play in her own milieu. So let's just make sure everyone understands we're not talking about a first century figure of CE. We're talking about I guess it's technically the second century figure of BCE.
There is the reason people might make the connection, not just for the name, is that there's quite a famous book from the medieval era, from the Middle Ages, medieval. I think medieval's right. That places her as the person in the Herod story, but that's wrong. That was
Yeah. I hadn't come across that particular.
Yeah, it's called Toldoth Yisu, and it's actually an anti-Christian book. It was written to bring the church down, and they link her in as that character. But it was like much of the medieval literature. It's just what people thought and not actual fact. Before
people living or dead is purely coincidental.
Right.
Okay, so Salome Alexandra was brought into the Hashmonean dynasty. That is to say, she was not a princess of the Hashmonean dynasty. She married into it. And she is quite famous for her brother, Shimon ben Shetach. Her brother was the leading proponent of what was developing as the Pharisaic group of rabbis. Well, the term rabbi hadn't become an official title yet. It was a title in the sense that it means teacher, but it wasn't a title that represented a particular allegiance to a philosophy of Judaism. But he was really the head of the Pharisaic group, which was kind of a problem, because at the time, the ruling class of the Hashmoneans were not terribly supportive of Pharisaic Judaism. So we probably need to explain a little bit about what the Hashmoneans were doing at this time, what they were like, and why they would not care so much for what Pharisaic Judaism was promoting. So when last we saw the Hashmoneans, at least the last time most people saw the Hashmoneans, was in the history books when they were reading about Judah the Maccabee and the fight against the Seleucid Empire and the restoration of Jewish independence. And it's one of those great end of movies, the scene fades, roll credits, and everything looks great. And the problem is that the Hashmonean dynasty, that's the family name of the Maccabees, Hashmoni, quickly degenerated into corrupt despotism. They should never have been king, because they were a Kohanic family. They, of course, could not be of the line of David, because the two lines can never cross. And that meant they had no business ruling as king, and they really should have worked to establish a true monarchy under a Davidic king. But once you're in power, it's really tempting to keep it. And they showed the best example of how marrying the religious power, that is to say the high priesthood, with political power, the kingship, really created absolute corruption. And within a couple generations, they were every bit as Hellenized and as corrupt as the Seleucid Empire that their grandparents had fought against. And it's enough to really make you cry when you realize how bad things went. So into this mix, you have Aristobulus I as the king high priest. They kind of sometimes didn't use the term king, but they acted as one, of the Hashmonean dynasty. And he marries this woman, Salome Alexandra, Salome Alexandra in Hebrew, and she comes in and tries to moderate his rule some, tries to help guide him to not be so harsh. But of course, a ruling family that has a political interest in maintaining the religious status quo, and which is operating the temple as their own private resource, for their own aggrandizement and their own material support, is not interested, especially in the philosophies of someone like her brother, Shimon ben Bentach, who is expounding a personal piety and the ability of a person to have a deep and meaningful connection to God outside of the temple precincts. This is very counterculture. This is very antithetical to what he stands for. Now, there's a much longer conversation that I'm sure we'll have some other day of where exactly this Pharisaic philosophy came from, how ancient it is. And the short answer of my opinion is that this is representing a emphasis on a theme that was in Judaism from the beginning. That they did not invent anything, but at certain points, as the corruption of the temple and the ruling dynasty became more and more apparent, this became the only viable alternative. And so received greater and greater emphasis among those who were disappointed, to be diplomatic, with how the temple was being run.
What struck me when I first read through some of the names in this list is how un-Jewish some of them sound.
Well, absolutely. Like I said, do you want to give the rundown of names that no one names their Jewish kids anymore?
Right, Alexander. Janus, which I'm assuming is from the god Janus, the two-faced god. Aristobulus couldn't be less Jewish. It couldn't be more Greek.
Hyrcanus.
Yeah, right. I mean, if you saw these as a cast list and didn't know this story, you really wouldn't know. You really wouldn't know.
Now, I should point out, however, the first name you mentioned, Alexander, or Alexandra for her, Alexander later for her second husband, is considered to be an acceptable Jewish name to this day.
Right, okay.
So Alexander the Great was considered to be a reasonable monarch from the point of view of Judaism. He allowed us to do our thing, and we were okay with that. World conquerors, we'd seen them, they'd come, they'd gone. We were used to it. So the only way we judged them wasn't whether they were conquering or not. They shouldn't have been. But if they were conquering, if they allowed people to continue to rule their own lands in their own ways and not interfere with us, then that got them a thumbs up. They should have stayed home and not gone around murdering people, but if they were going to do that, at least this was a positive thing. So Alexander, as opposed to most of the other conquerors, gets a relatively, a guarded, that he was an okay guy. And so Alexander has become a common Jewish, not so common anymore, but it was a common Jewish name for a long time.
Cool, okay. So she was appointed into her position, not born into it.
Okay, so she marries Aristobulus I, who dies in 104 BCE under slightly dubious circumstances. A lot of the people are dying under dubious circumstances. It's said that maybe he died out of grief because he had murdered his rival Antigonus I. Maybe Salome helped him exit this world in more direct means than simply holding his hand. We're not entirely sure. But what we do know is that as soon as he's dead, she is then married to his brother, because under Levirate laws, she and her first husband don't have any children. So she marries her brother Alexander Janus, or Yanai, who was in prison at the time. So he gets out of prison, marries his dead brother's wife, and he takes the throne. Now, he is an incredibly hostile adversary to the Pharisees.
And she is the brother of the leader of the Pharisees.
Exactly. Yes, it's you can't make this stuff up.
It's like a Shakespearean play.
That or a soap opera. I mean, it really is quite incredible how this ends up overlapping. And she does her best to keep Alexander Yanai in check, to not be as brutal as he wants to be. He basically overrides her many times and kills many Pharisaic rabbis, and refuses to accept or allow their rulings on any of the issues of the day. And in the process, he not only earns the hostility of the Pharisees, but he earns the hostility of the common people. So you might think that people who were so upset with the Hashmonean dynasty and how the temple was being run and its corruption would have simply turned their back on all of that and gone off and done their own thing. And if you were talking about the Qumran sect, the group that ends up writing the Dead Sea Scrolls, you'd be right. That is kind of what they did. But the vast majority of the people in Judea said, look, they're corrupt, they're bad, but the temple is still our heart, it's still our home. And although we are certainly emphasizing more and more for our own spiritual life, our private practice and our private observance of the commandments, we're still going to the temple for the festivals. We still want to see the temple rites performed properly. And so when Yanai doesn't, he is attacked by the people. There's a very famous story in the Talmud that's also matched in Josephus, where he incorrectly handles the lula,
The four species.
what's that? Not the four species. I'm getting ahead of myself. He incorrectly handles the water drawing ceremony, which takes place during Sukkot.
The libation, is it?
What's that?
The libation, is that what it's called?
Exactly. And of course, when he does it wrong and in a disrespectful manner, all the people who are gathered there that are currently holding their lulav and etrog, the four species that we take during Sukkot, take the etrog and throw it at him. So he gets pelted by all of these citrons and basically driven off the Temple Mount for incorrectly doing this, which of course just makes him angrier. Rather than making him go, maybe I'm doing something wrong, like many politicians, he gets angry at the people who point out his mistakes. He dies eventually, 76 BCE. He dies, and rather than appoint one of his children as the new leader and somebody as a regent, he appoints his wife as being the queen of Judea. Rather unprecedented, as I said before. No woman had ever ruled as the monarch by appointment rather than usurpation. And she sets about doing a great job of it. She takes over. She moderates his rule on all fronts, from foreign policy, where she pulls back from costly and bloody foreign engagements. And she also moderates, obviously, his rule against the Pharisees. Now, according to the Talmud, his deathbed, he actually tells her to do that, and says, be good to the Pharisees. Basically confessing that he should have been. And she brokers many compromises. One compromise is that he be buried with proper dignity and respect, because basically no one in the country wanted to honor this man in death. And she brokers a deal where he will be honored in death, and as a way of atonement. And she will do a much better job of reconciling the different factions within the Jewish people, which she sets about doing. The Pharisees, her brother being their leader, begin to implement their policies with regards to the temple and their policies with regards to personal practice of Judaism. She helps establish schools so that the children become better educated from a younger age. And she also, very importantly, protects the other groups of Jews. So there's a very real danger anytime you have a swing in political polarity of reprisals and of a backlash. And indeed, the Pharisees very much wanted to attack the Sadducees, which was the primary sect that represented the sort of ruling class of Yanai's time, and wipe them out, drive them from the country, make their teachings illegal, and everything. And she doesn't let them. She stops the Pharisees from behaving to the Sadducees the way Yanai and the Sadducees had behaved towards them. And she sets up protected towns where the Sadducees are even allowed to rule the religious life of the town according to their interpretations. Not important towns, but they do have a place where they can do that. And this creates a, shall we say, a healthy mix of Jewish ideas under her reign. That this is the first protected, pluralistic Jewish society that we've really seen. Where different opinions of how to interpret Torah, of how to apply Jewish law, are tolerated. There is an official accepted version that works for the government and works in the official temple, but you're allowed, within moderation, to also have other opinions. And this is a very important crucible for growing these new opinions and allowing these new ideas to develop. During this time, where no one can gain so much power that it becomes dominant and corrupt.
I'm just amazed at the turnaround from a time where the Pharisees were being persecuted by the monarch to a time where they were the ruling spiritual class or teaching class, and to still give safe havens for the people that were once trying to drive them out. I don't know whether that's incredibly clever an incredibly clever choice on behalf of a person who wants all of her subjects to respect her and to look after her, or whether it was just a really loving kind of thing to do as a leader. I'm not sure which way to fall on that. But she gave them...
Sometimes we're allowed to say both.
Both.
Right? It can be a smart political move, and it can be the right moral decision. Morality and politics are not always in opposition.
But yeah, she gave them walled cities, right? So they'd be protected, and also put them into positions where her neighboring countries would see that they had these, even the people who maybe weren't the most respected of their inhabitants still got these walled cities, which must have made her again look very good to the neighboring leaders, because even to the Sadducees she has time to give these wards. So she made really smart, intelligent choices. It's very impressive. So we've got some interesting it's very hard to say, because sometimes I read things in the Talmud and I'm like, yeah, that's an interesting idea. But particularly, most famously, I think it's that it only rained, or that it would always rain on a Friday night, on a Shabbat evening.
Right. So
do we take that with a pinch of salt?
So sometimes you have hyperbole in the Talmud that is used as a way of either praising or condemning someone, and we don't have to necessarily say this is literally what happened. We also don't have to say this is literally not what happened. The Talmud is usually more interested in making a point. And what the point they're trying to make here is that the idea that rain only fell on Friday night was that this was a blessing, that this was a good thing. I mean, you might think raining on Shabbat, that's terrible, but raining on Shabbat is when you don't have to work. So that's exactly the time you don't want rain. If you're out as a farmer and it's a rainy day, you're still in the field. And they don't have enclosed cabs on their harvesters. You're out there, up to your knees in mud and doing the best you can in the rain. So the idea that it would only rain on Friday was considered good for the people. And really that was the emphasis. The idea being that what she did was good for the people. It wasn't just good for the country, it wasn't just good politics, but that this was a blessing to the average person, to the basic people of Judea. And really that was incredibly important. So as I said, this gave a time for the Pharisees to mature in their opinions and their development, and really this was laying the groundwork for what would eventually become the full developed rabbinic Judaism. People often make a mistake and think that rabbinic Judaism and Pharisaic Judaism are identical, but they're not. Definitely many of the ideas of Pharisaic Judaism found their way into what became rabbinic Judaism as a movement, but there are many things in Pharisaic Judaism that did not make their way into rabbinic Judaism.
And vice versa.
Exactly.
At some point, like you said, we really have to go down and talk about what Pharisaic Judaism is and how and why it was the way it was, where it came from, and how it developed, because that's hugely interesting to me. So can you tell us a little bit about what it's become really apparent that we probably wouldn't be having this conversation if she hadn't been queen, right?
Well, first let me just point out what happened when she dies, right? Because to understand her lasting effects, we have to see that how quickly what she did was overturned, and why, and realize that without that brief window of her reign of 11 years or so, that it would have been even worse. So remember, she stands between Alexander Yanai, who is her second husband and who's the king before her, who was very hateful to the Pharisaic view and very dismissive of the popular people, and then her children, Hyrcanus and Aristobulus II, not to be confused with Aristobulus I, who she had been married to. They weren't doing that kind of thing.
I always get confused between the Aristobuluses.
Yeah, I know. It's just rolls off the tongue, doesn't it? So Mr. H and Mr. A, her two kids, each want to be the new high priest, and by high priest I mean king of the nation when she dies. And she tips towards Hyrcanus as being the next one, but Aristobulus II doesn't really care what mom says, because he wants to be in charge. So he begins to develop his own faction to fight against his brother, and his brother develops his own faction to fight back, and they each try to convince other foreign leaders in the surrounding countries to support their claim to the throne. High priesthood. They're still maintaining this fiction that they're not really the king, because they know that the people are more and more uncomfortable with this notion of a non-Davidic king. It was fine in times of wartime to have a non-Jewish, non-Davidic leader. Now, come on, guys. You've had 100 years. Let's see if we can get someone who's proper on the throne. And eventually they go and they talk to this local up-and-coming regional power and say, would you support us? And they each go separately. And this local power, people may know, called Rome. And Rome says, eeny, meeny, miny, mo. Hyrcanus seems a little bit more stable. We'll pick him. And by the way, you're now part of the empire. And zip, zam, zoom. The independence of Judea is gone in a flash, because the two brothers fight for who will be in charge. And we can argue about all sorts of counterfactuals of what would have happened if they hadn't gone to Rome and if it continued on its own and Rome would have caught up to them eventually, yada, yada, yada. But the fact of the matter is that the end of the Judean monarchy came not by invasion, but by the inability of two brothers to decide who would be ruler next. And that they invited occupation rather than had it forced upon them.
The story of the two women that come before Solomon with a baby springs to mind instantly there. And it's just sad that neither of them would say, yeah, fine, you have the baby.
Nope. They both would rather have the baby dead than if they weren't able to have it. I know. So that shows you exactly what the mentality was at that time of life in Judea. And the lasting effects that she had was that she gave this window of time of 11 years and what she was able to do to moderate her husband's rule on top, that allowed Judaism to have room to grow and breathe without this horrible destruction and persecution. If she hadn't been there, and it had only been Yanai and then one of her sons straight on, most likely they would have continued their father's policy straight away, and the Pharisaic philosophy and ideology would have been completely obliterated, which meant that there would have been no rabbinic Judaism, which means that all forms of Judaism would have either been completely temple-centric, at which point when the temple is destroyed, Judaism would have been wiped out, or they would have been completely anti-temple. That is to say, like the Dead Sea sect from the Qumran community, and completely rejected everything that was going on, which also, when the temple in Judea lost its independence, was basically wiped out, which is why we have no more Sadducees and we have no more Qumran people. But because she allowed this time for the faith to be embedded more and more commonly in the common person's activity, when the catastrophe comes, when the ruling classes become even worse under Herod and then the other appointees of Rome, the people are still able to maintain their Jewish identity. The corruption in the center does not necessarily spread as a corruption to all the rest. And that is hugely important. And on the other hand as well, by moderating the Pharisaic rule, by putting limits on what they could do to their opponents, it also began to put into place this notion, which was embedded and implicit within Judaism, but she made it explicit, which is, you don't make your point by killing your opponent. You don't make your point by using your power to dominate your opponent. You make your point by convincing your opponent. If you want to debate, if you want to bring your sources, if you want to bring your arguments, if you want to bring every possible example and an analogy you can to persuade your opponent and the rest of the nation to your view, go for it. And I will protect your right to do so. But if you want to use power in order to impose your views on others, well, no, we'll have an official view, of course, because we do have an official temple and we have official things that need to go on. But I'm not going to let you force other people in their own private practice to have to follow you. So this really creates the basic template that is so essential for Rabbinic Judaism. And one of the differences between it and Pharisaic Judaism, that decisions are made not by shows of force or by outdoing each other, but that decisions are made by consensus after reasoned argument and debate.
All right, there we are. That was Salome Alexandra. How cool was that? I wasn't. She has a special name, right? We didn't mention it at the beginning. I think most of the people that we talk about are going to have these.
Also known as.
Yeah, also known as names. Can you? Because I'm not even going to try to do this.
Well, in Hebrew, her name is Salome Alexandra, and the Alexandra, of course, is Alexandra. Salome would literally mean the peace of Zion. Which is a beautiful name, and a name that is still in common use in Israel in particular.
Well, thank you very much. I really appreciate all your time and allowing us to do this. It's been super interesting for me, and we got a lot of good feedback. If you've got if you've got people that you would like us to talk about, leave them in the comments below. We can't promise to get to everyone, but we'll probably get to most of them. We'll be doing this weekly for some time. So thank you very much, Rabbi Neely. It's been a really great honor to be able to listen to these and hear your the speeches, the talks that you're giving at your synagogues. That you're sharing those again with us. That's very kind of you.
Well, thank you for putting it all together and letting me share it with a much larger audience. And hopefully, it'll generate more conversation and more understanding of how we got to where we are and the shoulders of the giants that we're standing upon.
Absolutely. All right, so we'll see you all again very soon. Thank you again. Bye-bye.